In this series of videos we're going to look at scope planning. Now this cartoon, obviously it's supposed to be amusing, but it's one of those things that is so true. That's what makes it funny to an engineer anyhow. So scope planning, scope is what you need to produce. And one of the biggest challenges you have right at the beginning of the project, when the client and the consultant are busy working together to try to get the project going, one of the biggest challenges they have is for the client to communicate exactly what he wants. Now sometimes they don't know exactly what they want. They know they sort of want a building, over here, but that's about it. So it's up to the consultant to draw that out of them to get the specifics. So that's what scope planning is all about, is really developing a good idea of what needs to be delivered. And it's communication. As you can see, the customer just wanted a tire on a tree, but everyone misinterpreted it. The project sponsor, the senior architect, the engineers, whatever, and what was installed. And that happens all the time, is that at the end of the day you've built it and the client comes along and says, oh, that's not quite what we wanted. And that's a failure that happened right at the beginning because they didn't define the scope properly. And so that's what scope planning is all about, actually figuring out what do we actually need to do. So that's what these videos are all about. So scope definition, let's look at some of the words that we use. So scope is the boundaries of the project, the work that needs to be done to complete the project works, no more and no less. And that's not just the actual building, it's also the management works to enable it. And I'm going to talk about that more in the next slide. It covers both quantity and quality. So if the client wants 50 windows, that's the quantity. If he wants 50 windows that are spec'd to be able to withstand typhoon force winds, then that is quality. Okay, so you wouldn't do that in, say, Wellington or Christchurch, where they don't get typhoons, but they would spec it in, say, somewhere that's in the tropics, which gets typhoons 3-4 times a year. So the quality is fit for purpose. In this case, we've got windows that are on a building that could be exposed to typhoons. We don't want the windows to blow in, therefore we'd spec it for it. But in somewhere like Wellington or Auckland, you probably wouldn't. So quality is fit for purpose, the scope. Quantity is how much of it. They may have slight changes during the project, and these are called scope changes or variations. Now, this diagram, pretty simple diagram, shows us the scope. So the scope is what is included in the project, but you also want to be clear about what's not included in the project. So if you're building a road, the client might decide that they are going to get another company to come in and install the light posts, the lamp posts that are going to hold the lights. Okay, that happens quite a bit because that's a specialised work package. So they might say, well, all we want you to do is we want you to put the ducts in for the power cables for the light poles, and then we'll get someone else to come in after you've finished and put the lampposts in. Okay, so in that case there, an exclusion not included in the project would be the supply and installation of the lampposts. Now, as the project progresses, we may get scope changes, so also known as variations. And these are bits where you're adding a little bit to the scope. So a little bit is added. So it might be the client is saying, I would like you to widen the road a little bit. Or we might want you to add another footpath on the other side of the road, or widen the footpath so that we can put cyclists on it. So those sort of things can happen initiated by the client. There may also be scope changes initiated by the nature of the work. So you're digging away, the geotechnical reports showed that, let's say you're installing a building foundations, you're digging away, the geotechnical report showed that it was soft clay all the way down, but then you strike rock. Okay, there's an outcrop of rock that the geotechnical investigations didn't pick up. Now you have to actually bring in different machinery, and it's going to take longer to remove that rock. So the scope of the project was to install foundations in soft clay as shown on the geotechnical reports included in the contract document. But now you're excavating rock, which is a much more expensive and time consuming job. So therefore it's a variation. You have changed the scope of the project. And so you can see that you're still installing the same foundations, but the nature of the work has changed. And so that's quite important to understand. Also, I haven't shown it here, but I should have shown a little bite coming out of the scope. So it may be that the scope actually reduces, or parts of the scope reduce during the project. So for example, you're doing a construction project, it's running a bit over budget, there's been some variations, and the client says, well, we need to bring it in on budget, so what we're going to do is, instead of having a footpath on either side of the road, we're going to have only one footpath on the north side of the road, or something like that. So the scope changes, the variations can increase or decrease. Now in NZS 3910 there's quite a substantial chapter about scope changes, about variations, how to identify them, what they are, and then the process that we undertake to process those, because variations, when they happen, things need to happen. The schedule needs to change because it might be more time or less time to sort of do the job, so that needs to change, usually for more time. If there's less time, the contractor will just say it and we'll just take it and say thank you very much. And the budget needs to change. If you add something, you need to pay for it. You don't get scope changes, you don't get variations for free. And so that all needs to happen at the time when the decision's being made whether to vary the scope of the project or not. And that's what NZS, that section in NZS 3910 is all about. Okay, now there's two different types of scope, product scope and project scope. The product scope is all about the features and functions of the deliverables, in other words, what will be delivered. So if we're building a bridge, what will be delivered is the bridge. The bridge is the product scope. Parts of that, components of it, will be the towers, the extension cables, the deck, the abutment, the piers. So that is all the product scope. But there's also the work that enables the product to be built, and that is how the project will be delivered, and we call that the project scope. So that's the planning, the communication, the organising, monitoring, administration and reporting that has to happen in order for this thing to happen. So the guys that are pouring concrete for this pier are working on the product scope. They are building the deliverable. But the person that planned the order that it was going to be built in, that communicated that order to the construction team, that organised for the delivery of the material, the concrete and the steel to the site, that monitored it, to do the testing of the concrete when it arrives, checks the dimensions, makes sure that the workers are being paid, and then reports back to his boss about how the progress of the thing's going. That is all someone doing the project scope. So that's the difference. The project scope is those management activities that we're studying in project management, and the product scope is the end result, the thing that you're delivering. So scope management is the processes required to ensure that the project includes all the work required and only the work required. So and as I said, the scope can change, and so there are these yellow ones, the planning processes. There's plan the scope management. We don't really sort of do that all that much. I'll talk about that in the next video. Collect requirements. What are you actually supposed to do? What does the client want the thing to do? Define the scope. Take those requirements and define what needs to be done. So the client wants some way of getting traffic from one side of of a river to another side. So you'll have gone through all the options, and then you'll define the scope of it. This is the bridge that we need to build, or this is the tunnel, or whatever it is. And then we break it down. We break it down into little pieces, because most civil engineering projects are just too big to manage as one piece. You need to break it down into small little bite-sized pieces that you can manage. In addition to that, when the thing kicks off, you've got these executing processes, and notice that scope, time, cost, they are all so closely integrated to each other that we cannot separate them. And so the director manage the project work is 4.3. That's an integration management activity, and that includes the execution of this, of executing the scope, the time, the cost, and we'll look at this more later on. And then at the end of the project, this was supposed to be red, same color as that, closing processes, is validate scope, this is monitoring. Monitoring. So you need to validate the scope, you need to make sure that what you're delivering is what was required, and control the scope. If it's not if you're not delivering what you're supposed to deliver, then you need to do something about it. So take control. So that's monitoring and controlling processes. So in the next video we'll look at scope management in a little bit more detail.